Let's cross now to Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, who will give us Labour's view on this concrete crisis. Ms Phillipson, I hope you can hear me. Lovely to speak to you. It's the first time you've come on the show, so I'm delighted to have you. I mean, what's your reaction to what's been happening in schools, the last-minute nature of these closures? I know that you have your own school-aged children like me and that they attend state schools. Are you worried about them going into the classroom this week?
No, I'm pleased that children are returning to school, including my own children. It's really important that they get back to their learning. But, I appreciate that lots of parents across the country will be concerned because, sadly, many children are not going to be able to return to education or will be moved into porta cabins or alternative accommodation because of the risk that this kind of crumbly concrete is going to pose. It all feels very last minute. And what we're calling on the government to do is to publish a full list of all of the schools affected so that parents can be confident about where the problems are. And if they're not prepared to do that, we'll force a vote in Parliament this week to make it happen.
And are you worried that the government has been rather trying to cover up how many schools are affected? We see reports in the newspapers this morning that there's also hospitals affected. There's now new fears over asbestos. There's the suggestion perhaps that this concrete has been used in other public buildings that may again put public safety at risk.
I am concerned that we don't yet know the full extent of all of this. There are reports that engineers are being sent into schools to do further assessments around the condition. So I think it is important that we get to the bottom of all of this. But, this comes back to sticking plasters, really. Of course, it's right that the government put in place mitigations to keep children safe. But one of the first actions of an incoming Conservative government in 2010 was to cancel Labour's school rebuilding programme. And here we are, 13 years on, and the chickens have come home to roost.
I mean, at the same time, you might say that, to be fair, this has been a historic problem. I remember when I first started out in journalism covering these sorts of stories. They also happened under Blair's leadership. Historically, perhaps successive governments simply have not done enough to reinforce the school estate.
Well, the last Labour government had a major school rebuilding programme, and it was the Conservatives who cancelled that plan we had that would have meant that every single secondary school in England would have been rebuilt or significantly been refurbished by 2020. So if that had happened, we wouldn't be having this same conversation now about some of those secondary schools that are sadly not going to be reopening or reopening fully as planned this week. But alongside that, many of the schools in question have a length of time that the schools were intended to be built for. They've long since passed that natural life, and I think it is frankly negligent that the government have time and again cut the funding for school rebuilding, but alongside that have just failed consistently to be upfront about the scale of the challenge we face. I've been raising this with ministers for months and months and months, and they've known for a very long time about the need for action. So I think this last-minute scrabble really should have been avoided. It's not fair for parents, and it's certainly not fair for school leaders who are trying to get everything back up and running at the start of the new term.
Although, according to the IFS, one particular Labour proposal, should you take power come the next general election, this proposal to scrap the tax breaks afforded to private schools could end up costing the taxpayer money. The IFS has concluded that it may push 40,000 private school pupils into state schools. You've already raised issues about classrooms being overcrowded, so I'd be interested to know how you'd solve that problem, but also that the policy could cost the taxpayer £300 million. Are you rethinking this policy? It sounds to some like the politics of envy, Ms Phillipson.
No, it's about making sure that we're investing in our state schools where the vast majority of children go to school. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies concluded that Labour's plans to end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, that would raise between £1.3 to £1.5 billion a year. I think that is a considerable sum of money. We would use that money to deliver more teachers into our classrooms, better mental health support for our children, and high and rising standards in all of our state schools. I see no good reason why private schools continue to enjoy these tax breaks. And I hope the Chancellor might at some point decide to act and end those tax breaks so that we can prioritise state education. That's what a Labour government would be doing right now.
How will you find classroom spaces for 40,000 new kids in state schools?
Well, the IFS recognised that overall net the changes to tax breaks would raise 1.3 to 1.5 billion. So it'll be raising considerable sums of money. Actually, alongside that, we're seeing demographic shift that means there will be ample space for any children. But it's a lot of the private schools who scaremonger around some of this. I just don't accept that.
What do you mean,
They've been putting up their costs year on year beyond... Well, the private schools have been putting up their fees year on year beyond inflation. I think they've got the scope to cut a bit here and there.
What do you mean by...
And actually, this policy will raise money.
What do you mean by demographic shifts, which mean that you're going to have more spaces in schools? We've had the Labour Party banging on for the last 13 years about a lack of classroom space. So how are you going to accommodate 40,000 kids switching from private to state? You can't build schools that quickly, can you?
Well, sadly, in large parts of the country, schools are beginning to close because we're seeing fewer young people arriving at secondary school. There are fewer young people of secondary school age. But actually, the IFS was very clear that it endorsed what we had said around the revenue that could be raised. And it's achievable. We know we can do it. I'm confident we can do it. We will do it because we need to put that money into state education.
But what about parental choice? I mean, you do appreciate that not everybody that sends their children to a private school is driving into the car park in a Rolls Royce. What about the just about managing who have chosen private education over state and are then going to be clobbered with school fees that are probably going to be 25% higher and therefore completely unaffordable? Does Labour not represent those sorts of constituents?
I'll never criticise individual parents for wanting to do what's right and best by their children. Of course, I think parental choice is incredibly important, but actually for the vast majority of parents, including middle-class parents, private schools are way beyond their reach. I mean, the average fee is in the region of £15,000 per year per child. That is beyond most people, and private schools have put up their fees way above inflation year on year. So actually, I think most parents would want a Secretary of State that's prioritising funding and resources and standards in our state schools. I mean, that's where 93% of children are. That's my priority.
David Blunkett, who I think you'll agree knows quite a lot about schools but also about Labour politics, has given an interview to the Sunday Telegraph today where he basically says that Labour would need a miracle to win the next general election. Has he got that wrong?
I agree, it's a tall order, not least coming off the back of such a big defeat in 2019. But I'm confident that under Keir Starmer, we're looking outwards to the country. We're setting out the change that a Labour government would deliver. We're not complacent about that. There's still a long time to go until the election, whenever it comes. But I tell you, that general election cannot come soon enough. People are crying out for change. And this government is just lingering on. And people are really struggling. So I think the British people should decide.
And equally, though, he doesn't seem to be too enthused by Starmer or indeed the cabinet to which you belong. He talks about the glory days of Robin Cook and Margaret Beckett and so-called knowns, and says that unfortunately the current shadow cabinet just isn't recognisable enough to the public. Is that a fair criticism?
I have the utmost respect for David, and I've spent quite a lot of time with him talking about how he transformed education in 1997 when he was Education Secretary. So I'll happily take advice and support from David on all of those issues. But of course, yes, absolutely, we've still got a job of work to do in communicating our message to the public and getting out there and showing people that we're on their side. But if you take me back to where we were in 2019 after that devastating defeat, you know, the worst that we'd ever experienced since the 30s, and said to me now that we would have turned the party around and we'd be looking outwards to the country, then I'm not sure I would have believed you. So we've made enormous progress. I completely accept that there is more to do in communicating it. That's why I'm here this morning speaking to you, telling you about the difference a Labour government would make. Breakfast clubs in our schools, cutting the cost of school uniform, more teachers in our classrooms. We've got a lot to say, and I really look forward to the chance to make that argument in a general election.
How widespread do you think Keir Starmer's reshuffle will be this week? And unkind Labour sources have sort of described John Healey as, quote, too tame to take on Grant Shapps as Defence Secretary. Will the likes of Mr Healey keep his job? Will he be out? Who would you like to see back in the Cabinet? Shadow Cabinet.
You'll understand that these are all matters... Sure, you'll understand that these are all matters for Keir as leader of our party, so I'm not going to be getting into any speculation about names or anything of that kind. These are matters for Keir, and we're all of us, both those of us on the front bench and those of us on the back benches, we're focused on making sure that we're in a strong position going into the election so that we can deliver the change that people desperately want to see.
Couple more final questions for you, Ms Phillipson. I wondered what you made of Penny Mordaunt's suggestion that young people should do compulsory national service.
I'm not convinced about that. I think I want young people to have opportunities to engage in volunteering, skills, taking part in their community. Lots of young people already do that, whether that's through the Duke of Edinburgh Award, through Scouts. There's a whole range of ways that young people contribute to our society. I've not been persuaded by that, and I'm not quite clear what the full plan she's setting out would involve.
And very briefly, is Sadiq Khan's ULEZ going to cost you votes in London, as was the case with the Uxbridge by-election?
I accept the need to take action and make sure that we've got clean air. I think the challenge has been making sure that people are supported during this cost of living crisis, and that's why Sadiq Khan has rightly put in place additional measures around scrappage. But the government have said, they've asked local authorities to put in place these kinds of plans, and now they've got the brass neck to complain about it.
Thank you very much, Bridget Phillipson, for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.